For 20 years, Michael Carter believed he had the perfect marriage, a beautiful home, two wonderful children, and a wife he trusted with every part of his life. Then one night, a phone call after midnight, a series of mysterious bank transfers, and a young woman calling his wife Mom. In a single moment, everything Michael believed about his marriage began to fall apart. What he was about to uncover wasn't just an affair. It was a secret buried for over 2 decades, a secret powerful enough to destroy an entire family. For 20 years, Michael Carter believed he had the perfect marriage, a beautiful home, 2 wonderful children, and a wife he trusted with every part of his life. Then one night, a phone call after midnight, a series of mysterious bank transfers, and a young woman calling his wife Mom. In a single moment, everything Michael believed about his marriage began to fall apart. What he was about to uncover wasn't just an affair. It was a secret buried for over 2 decades, a secret powerful enough to destroy an entire family. For 20 years, Michael Carter believed he was one of the lucky ones. He had built a successful career, a comfortable home in a quiet suburb, 2 children who had grown into responsible young adults, and above everything else, he had Laura, the woman he had fallen in love with the very first time they met at a hospital charity fundraiser. To everyone around them, Michael and Laura were the definition of a perfect couple. They rarely argued. They attended every neighborhood gathering together. Every Christmas, Laura cooked dinner while Michael decorated the front porch with lights. Friends often joked that they would grow old together in the same house. Michael believed that too. At least, he used to. The cracks didn't appear overnight. They formed slowly, quietly, until one day they became impossible to ignore. Looking back, Michael couldn't remember exactly when Laura started changing. Maybe 4 years earlier. She began working late more often. Business trips suddenly became frequent. Whenever her phone rang, she walked outside before answering. She always placed her phone face down on the table. At first, Michael never questioned any of it. He trusted her completely. If she said she had to work late, he made dinner. If she had to travel, he drove her to the airport himself. He had never searched her phone, never checked her messages, never tracked where she went, because Michael believed a marriage should be built on trust, not suspicion. Then one evening, Laura's phone vibrated while she was preparing dinner. She glanced at the screen. The smile on her face disappeared. "I'll be right back." She walked into the backyard with the phone. Standing alone in the kitchen, Michael could barely hear fragments of her conversation. "Not now. Please don't call me again. I'll take care of it." A few moments later, she walked back inside, wearing the same gentle smile. "Just a client," Michael nodded. But for the first time, something didn't feel right. A few weeks later, a notification from their bank caught his attention. A large transfer had been made from their joint account. When he asked Laura about it, she answered almost immediately. "I invested in a friend's business." "How much?" "Not that much." The conversation ended there. Too quickly, too easily. Over the following months, the distance between them quietly grew. Laura still took care of the family. She never forgot birthdays. She still prepared breakfast every morning. But every time Michael wanted to talk, she said she was tired. Late at night, he often woke up to the glow of her phone lighting her face in the darkness. The moment she noticed him moving, she locked the screen. One Sunday afternoon, the entire family gathered for lunch. Their children laughed. Laura smiled. From the outside, they still looked like the perfect American family, yet deep inside, Michael could no longer recognize the woman sitting across from him. That evening, Laura told him she needed to visit a sick friend at the hospital the following week. Michael simply smiled. "Drive safely." She kissed him on the cheek and went upstairs. Michael remained alone in the living room. His eyes rested on their wedding photo hanging on the wall. Laura's smile in that picture was filled with hope. He quietly sighed. For the first time in 20 years, he asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. What if the woman he loved had been hiding something all along? That night, Michael barely slept. Michael didn't sleep. For 3 nights in a row, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, desperately trying to convince himself that everything was just a misunderstanding. 20 years of marriage couldn't possibly collapse because of a few suspicious signs. But the harder he tried to dismiss his doubts, the clearer every memory became. Laura hadn't changed overnight. The transformation had started years earlier. She began staying late at work. Business trips became more frequent. Her phone was always on silent. Whenever a message arrived, she instinctively turned the screen face down. Years ago, Michael had asked about it. Laura simply laughed. "You're overthinking it, Michael. I'm just busy with a new project," he believed her. Because Michael had always believed that trust, not control, was the foundation of a healthy marriage. Now, every small detail he had ignored had become another piece of a terrifying puzzle. The following morning, Michael called his office and requested a personal day. He didn't tell anyone why. Instead, he drove straight to the bank, not to check his balance, but to review nearly 20 years of transaction history. The bank employee printed hundreds of pages. Michael sat alone inside his SUV, turning each page one by one. At first, everything looked normal. Mortgage payments, utility bills, college savings, family vacations. Nothing unusual. Then, he noticed a transfer, $3,000. A few months later, $8,000, then $12,000, $15,000, $20,000. Every payment had been sent to the exact same account. The recipient's name read Daniel Brooks. Michael frowned. He had never heard that name before. He kept flipping through the statements. Year after year, transfer after transfer. The payments never stopped. When he finally reached the last page, he calculated the total. Over $400,000. His mouth went dry. How could Laura have secretly transferred nearly $500,000 over 2 decades, without him ever knowing? That afternoon, Laura called. "Where are you?" "At work." "You'll be home for dinner?" "Yeah." His voice never changed. Calm, steady, almost emotionless. He wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. He needed answers before asking questions. 2 days later, Laura told him she was visiting a close friend at the hospital. Michael smiled. "Drive safely." She kissed him goodbye and left. Exactly 10 minutes later, Michael quietly grabbed his keys. Keeping a safe distance behind her silver SUV, he followed. Laura never drove toward the hospital. Instead, she headed into a quiet suburban neighborhood. Eventually, she stopped in front of a 2-story house. Michael parked half a block away. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear himself breathe. Laura stepped out of the car. A moment later, the front door opened. A man in his late 50s walked outside. He smiled warmly. Then he wrapped Laura in a long, familiar embrace. Not the awkward hug between old friends. Not the polite greeting of former colleagues. This was the embrace of 2 people who had shared countless moments together. Michael froze. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. Several minutes later, the front door opened again. A young woman, around 18 years old, came running outside. She threw her arms around Laura, then shouted with excitement, "Mom!" Time stopped. Michael couldn't hear the rest of their conversation. He didn't need to. That single word destroyed everything he thought he knew. His marriage, his memories, his entire life. He didn't storm into the house. He didn't scream. He didn't make a scene. Instead, he quietly started the engine. As he drove away, the house slowly disappeared in his rearview mirror. But the sound of that single word, "Mom," echoed inside his mind again. And again, and again. For the first time in 20 years, Michael Carter felt his heart completely shatter. Michael drove without knowing where he was going. His hands remained on the steering wheel, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Only when he pulled into the parking lot beside the lake where he had proposed to Laura 23 years earlier did he realize where he was. The water was perfectly still, just like the expression on his face. Inside, everything had already collapsed. That night, Michael didn't ask Laura a single question. He still sat across from her at the dinner table. He still asked how her day had been. He even smiled when she told a funny story about one of her coworkers. Laura never noticed anything unusual. After 20 years of living with secrets, she had become remarkably good at living 2 separate lives. One life belonged to Michael, the devoted wife, the loving mother, the woman everyone admired. The other life belonged to Daniel Brooks. And now, Michael had seen both with his own eyes. The next morning, Michael made an appointment with the only person he believed he could trust, David Harrison, the city's most respected divorce attorney. More importantly, his college roommate and closest friend for over 30 years. David listened without interrupting. He didn't take notes. He simply watched Michael carefully as he recounted everything. The midnight phone calls, the unexplained bank transfers, the house in the suburbs, the older man, and finally, the young woman who had called Laura. "Mom!" When Michael finished speaking, silence filled the office. David leaned back in his chair. "Do you want to file for divorce?" Michael stared out the window. After several seconds, he quietly shook his head. "No!" David looked surprised. "You still want to save the marriage?" Michael slowly turned back toward him. "I want the truth," David frowned. "The truth? I need to know when this really started. Was it only an affair? Or—" Michael's voice became almost a whisper. "Has my entire marriage been built on a lie?" David understood immediately. For Michael, the betrayal wasn't the most painful part. The uncertainty was. Not knowing which memories had been real, not knowing whether the woman he had loved for 20 years had ever truly belonged to him. David agreed to help, legally, carefully. Over the following days, they collected every document they could obtain: financial records, property ownership, public court filings, business registrations. Every file seemed to raise even more questions. Then one discovery changed everything. Daniel Brooks wasn't struggling financially. He wasn't unemployed. He wasn't dependent on Laura. In fact, he owned a successful mid-sized construction company. Michael stared at the report. If he has money, why has Laura been sending him hundreds of thousands of dollars? David slowly shook his head. It doesn't make sense. If they were simply having an affair, he wouldn't need her financial support. Michael remained silent. That same question had been haunting him for days. 3 days later, David called again. "I found something else." Michael drove to his office immediately. David handed him a copy of an old county housing record, 20 years earlier, only a few months before Laura married Michael. Laura Mitchell and Daniel Brooks had signed a lease together. The move-in date, the move-out date. Everything matched the exact period when Laura had told Michael she was temporarily living with her older sister. Michael felt his chest tighten. For the first time, a terrifying question entered his mind. Had Daniel been Laura's first great love? And had Michael simply become the safer choice? That evening, the family gathered to celebrate Ethan's 20th birthday. The house was filled with laughter. Laura smiled as she placed candles on the cake. Their children had no idea that their family stood on the edge of disaster. Michael watched them carefully. He loved his children more than anything in the world. That was exactly why he refused to make any decision until he knew the complete truth. As dinner was coming to an end, Laura's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. The color instantly drained from her face. "Excuse me, I need to take this." She walked quickly toward the backyard. Michael remained seated for several seconds. Then, for the first time in 20 years, he quietly stood up and followed his wife. Standing behind the sliding glass door, he could hear only fragments of the conversation. "Don't call me right now. Michael's home. I'll send the money later." Then, one final sentence. "She must never find out." Michael froze. She? His mind immediately returned to the young woman outside Daniel's house. If his instincts were right, Laura was hiding something far bigger than a 20-year affair. She was protecting a secret that had the power to destroy every single person in their family. Michael didn't sleep that night. The final words he had overheard echoed through his mind over and over again. She must never find out. Who was she? The young woman he had seen outside Daniel's house? Or was there another secret still hidden beneath everything he had already discovered? Michael realized something important. If he confronted Laura now, she would only give him another carefully prepared lie. He needed facts, not excuses. The complete truth. The following morning, David called. "I found someone." "Who?" "Daniel's former neighbor." Michael left immediately. The woman waiting inside David's office was in her 70s. Her name was Margaret Wilson. She had lived next door to Daniel more than 20 years earlier. David showed her an old photograph of Laura. Margaret barely looked at it. "I remember her." "You're sure?" "I'm positive. They lived together for almost 2 years." Michael's heart skipped a beat. Margaret continued. "Back then, everyone thought they were married. She even wore a wedding ring." Michael could barely breathe. They were planning to get married. The room fell silent. Finally, Michael asked, "What happened?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "I don't know. One day she simply disappeared. A few months later, Daniel was living alone. The drive back was painfully quiet. David finally broke the silence. "It's possible Laura left Daniel before she ever met you." Michael kept his eyes on the road. Maybe, but she never told me. Not once. Not in 20 years, that evening. Michael opened an old wooden box stored in the basement. Inside were wedding photographs, love letters, vacation tickets, birthday cards, every memory from their marriage. He stared at each photograph. For the first time, he wasn't sure which memories were genuine and which had been built on lies. A few days later, Laura announced she would be attending a weekend business seminar. Michael already knew it wasn't true. This time, David came with him. They followed her together. Laura drove to the same suburban house. Daniel walked outside carrying her suitcase. Neither man said a word. They simply watched. Then, the young woman appeared. She was carrying a folder filled with documents. As she hurried across the driveway, one sheet slipped onto the ground. Before she picked it up, Michael caught a glimpse of the title. Certified copy of birth certificate. Below it, one surname stood out. Brooks. Michael's pulse quickened. If the young woman was Daniel Brooks' daughter, why had she called Laura Mom? The answer had to be far more complicated than an affair. Whatever Laura had hidden had begun long before Michael ever entered her life. Michael remained inside his car long after Laura disappeared into the house. His eyes stayed fixed on the driveway. The image of that birth certificate refused to leave his mind. Only two possibilities made sense. Either Laura was the girl's biological mother, or she had become her stepmother. Neither explanation fit the story Laura had told for the last 20 years. Either way, she had hidden an entire chapter of her life. 2 days later, David called again. I found another lead. What is it? I tracked down the attorney who handled an old family case nearly 20 years ago. Michael gripped the steering wheel. Does he still have the file? No. But he remembers it, and he remembers the woman. The retired attorney welcomed them into his office. After studying Laura's photograph for several moments, he quietly nodded. I can't be 100% certain, but she looks very familiar. Michael leaned forward. What kind of case was it? The attorney remained silent for a few seconds. It wasn't an adoption. He slowly removed his glasses. It was a voluntary surrender of parental rights. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. The attorney explained. Nearly 20 years earlier, a young couple had separated shortly after the birth of their daughter. A legal battle over custody followed. Eventually, the mother signed documents surrendering custody to the child's father. The official records had long since been sealed, but one memory had stayed with him. I remember that young woman. She cried through the entire meeting. Before signing, she asked me the same question again and again. He looked directly at Michael. If my daughter ever wants to find me someday, will she be allowed to? Michael walked out of the office in complete silence. For weeks, his anger had fueled every decision. Now, something else appeared, confusion. If Laura truly had a daughter before they were married, why had she hidden the truth? Was she ashamed? Was she protecting herself? Or had she been protecting someone else? 3 days later, Laura suggested a family dinner at their favorite restaurant. She smiled more than usual. Their children laughed. Everything appeared perfectly normal, but Michael noticed one small detail. Every time Laura's phone vibrated, she secretly glanced beneath the table. When dessert arrived, she stood. I'll be right back, Michael smiled at Ethan. I need to make a quick phone call. Instead, he quietly followed Laura. She never entered the restroom. Instead, she walked down a private hallway near the back entrance. Someone was already waiting there, Daniel Brooks. They spoke for less than 2 minutes. No hugs, no kisses, no touching, only fear. Michael couldn't hear every word, but one sentence reached him clearly. Daniel looked at Laura. He's starting to suspect something. Laura answered in a trembling voice. I'll handle it. Daniel slowly shook his head. No. It's already too late. At that exact moment, Daniel turned. His eyes met Michael's. The two men stood frozen at opposite ends of the hallway. Neither one spoke. Neither one moved. Both understood the same thing. The secret that had survived for 20 years was finally coming to an end. Laura was already waiting in the living room when Michael came home. A large brown envelope rested quietly on the coffee table. She looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept in days. Without looking directly at him, she spoke. You should read it. Michael slowly picked up the envelope. Inside was a stack of legal documents. The first page was an old Dana report. His eyes immediately stopped on one sentence. Daniel Brooks is the biological father of Emily Brooks. He slowly turned to the next page. It was a certified copy of a court order, voluntary termination of parental rights. The mother's name was clearly printed at the bottom, Laura Mitchell. Michael closed his eyes. The room became painfully quiet. When he finally looked back at Laura, she was already crying. "I wanted to tell you, so many times, but every time I tried, I couldn't." Michael's voice was calm, almost frighteningly calm. "Emily, is your daughter?" Laura nodded. "Yes, and you've hidden her from me for 20 years. Another long silence filled the room. Michael wasn't angry because Laura had a daughter before they met. That wasn't what broke him. What shattered him was realizing that for 2 decades, Laura had never believed he was strong enough to hear the truth. He carefully placed the documents back into the envelope. "Is that everything?" Laura lowered her head. She couldn't answer. Her silence told him everything. The envelope had revealed only part of the story. Somewhere beneath it, there was still another truth waiting to be uncovered. And Michael feared that truth might be even worse. Laura sat motionless. Her fingers were intertwined so tightly that the knuckles had turned white. The ticking clock echoed through the silent room. Neither of them moved. Michael didn't rush her. He simply watched the woman he had shared 20 years of his life with. Finally, Laura spoke. "Do you remember the first day we met?" Michael didn't answer. "It was at the hospital charity fundraiser." She smiled weakly. "I had broken up with Daniel less than a year earlier. I honestly believed that chapter of my life was over. I thought I could start again." Michael remained silent. "But Daniel never really disappeared." Laura slowly explained everything. After signing away custody of Emily, she fell into severe depression. Months later, she met Michael. Several times she had planned to tell him the truth. Every single time, fear stopped her. She was terrified that he would leave. "So," Michael finally asked, "you chose to lie instead?" Laura nodded through tears. "Yes." She walked upstairs. A few minutes later, she returned carrying an old notebook. Inside, every payment she had secretly sent over the last 20 years was carefully recorded. Each entry included a handwritten note: Emily's tuition, heart surgery expenses, dormitory fees, laptop for college, graduation gift. Michael slowly turned every page. Not a single payment had been made for Daniel. Every dollar had been for Emily. Laura's voice trembled. "I wasn't allowed to raise my daughter. The least I could do was help take care of her at that exact moment." The doorbell rang. Laura froze. Michael opened the door. Emily stood outside holding an old cardboard box. "I think these belong to my mother." Inside the box were dozens of handwritten letters. Every one of them had been written by Laura. None had ever been mailed. Michael unfolded the first letter. The opening line nearly stopped his heart. "My sweet Emily, today I wore a wedding dress, but the bride standing at the altar wasn't the mother you deserved." Michael slowly lowered the letter. For the first time, he saw Laura differently. Not as a woman who had simply betrayed her husband, but as a mother who had spent 20 years punishing herself. Yet even that could never erase 20 years of lies. Michael held the letters for a long time. He recognized Laura's handwriting immediately. The ink had faded. Some pages were stained with dried tears. He unfolded another letter. "Happy 4th birthday, sweetheart. I stood across the street today and watched you blow out your candles. I wanted to run to you, but I was afraid you'd ask why your mother wasn't there." He opened another. "Today was your first day of school. I bought you a blue backpack. I left it quietly at your front door before sunrise. Then I drove away before anyone could see me." Another letter. "If you ever read these words someday, you may hate me. You have every right to. But please believe one thing. There has never been a single day when I stopped loving you." Michael slowly closed the stack of letters. He no longer saw a cold-hearted woman. He saw a broken mother who had imprisoned herself inside 20 years of guilt. Emily quietly explained what had happened. "My dad kept every letter. He knew Mom wanted to send them, but she never found the courage." Michael looked at her. "Why did your father allow Laura to stay involved all these years?" Emily lowered her eyes. "Because Dad had heart disease. He always believed he didn't have much time left. He wanted me to know my mother. Even if it had to happen from a distance." A few days later, Daniel Brooks was rushed to the hospital. His condition had become critical. Before losing consciousness, he made one final request. He wanted to see Michael. The attending physician approached him quietly. He says, "He owes you an apology." Michael stood silently outside the intensive care unit. He had never imagined that one day he would walk into the room of the man who had haunted his marriage for more than 20 years. The attending physician opened the door. "You have about 15 minutes, Michael nodded. Inside, Daniel Brooks lay motionless in the hospital bed, an IV line stretched across his arm. The heart monitor produced a slow, steady rhythm. Daniel opened his eyes as the door closed behind Michael. "You came!" Michael pulled a chair closer to the bed. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Michael looked at him calmly. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" Daniel took a slow breath. "For forcing you to live inside a lie." His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "Laura wanted to tell you, more times than you could ever imagine. I stopped her." Michael frowned. "Why?" Daniel closed his eyes. "Because I was afraid. I was afraid Emily would lose the only family she still had. I convinced myself I was protecting my daughter, but I was only protecting my own fear." A tear rolled down his face. "It was the most selfish decision I've ever made." Daniel reached toward the bedside table. With trembling hands, he picked up a sealed envelope. Inside, my will. Everything I own belongs to Emily. I don't want anyone believing Laura stayed close to me because of money. Michael accepted the envelope. Daniel gently held his wrist. "If Emily ever needs help, please, don't let her pay for the mistakes we made." Michael looked directly into his eyes. "You have my word," Daniel smiled for the first time. It was peaceful, almost relieved. Seconds later, the heart monitor suddenly erupted into a sharp warning tone. Doctors rushed into the room. Nurses shouted emergency orders. Michael stepped back against the wall. He watched silently as the medical team fought to save the man he had hated for so long. Several minutes later, the lead physician slowly removed his gloves. He lowered his head. "I'm sorry. Time of death." Daniel Brooks was gone. Michael looked down at the envelope, still resting in his hands. Inside, there wasn't only a will. There was also one final handwritten letter addressed to him. The first line read, "If you're reading this, it means I ran out of time to fix the greatest mistake of my life." Daniel's funeral took place 3 days later. A gentle rain fell throughout the morning. Only a small group attended. Former co-workers, a few distant relatives, several old neighbors. Michael stood quietly near the back. He never approached the front. He wasn't family. He wasn't even a friend. Yet he came. Not for Daniel, but to honor the promise he had made inside that hospital room. Emily stood beside her father's portrait. Laura wore a simple black dress. For the first time in 20 years, mother and daughter stood together without hiding. After the funeral, Michael finally opened Daniel's last letter. Every page contained only one purpose: a confession. Daniel admitted that Laura had tried countless times to tell Michael everything. Each time, he had convinced her to remain silent. Near the end of the letter, he wrote, "If anyone deserves to pay for 20 years of lies, it is me." 3 months later, Michael and Laura finalized their divorce. There were no courtroom arguments, no bitter accusations, no fight over money, only silence. Before leaving the courthouse, Laura quietly said, "Thank you for not turning me into your enemy." Michael looked at her for a long moment, then answered softly, "I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't always mean we can begin again." They walked away in opposite directions. A marriage that had lasted more than 20 years had finally come to an end. Michael realized something that day. Betrayal doesn't always begin when love disappears. Sometimes it begins with a single lie, repeated for so many years that eventually everyone pays the price. 1 year later, autumn returned. Michael had moved into a smaller home. He spent more time with his children than ever before. He never lied to them about what had happened, but he never filled their hearts with hatred either. Instead, he told them, "Everyone makes mistakes. What defines us is whether we learn from them." Laura also began a new chapter. She lived a quieter life. No more secrets, no more hidden meetings, no more lies. She devoted herself to rebuilding her relationship with Emily, slowly, patiently, one step at a time. Months later, Emily graduated from college. Both Michael and Laura attended the ceremony. Afterward, Michael smiled at her. "Your father loved you very much." Emily embraced him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for keeping your promise." That same afternoon, Michael visited Daniel's grave. He placed a bouquet of white lilies on the headstone, then quietly whispered, "Our agreement. I kept my word," he turned and walked away. There was no anger left, no bitterness, only peace. Years later, Michael would often reflect on everything that had happened. He realized that what destroys a marriage isn't always betrayal itself. Sometimes, it's the moment two people begin believing that silence is safer than the truth, because the truth may hurt for a day, but a lie can destroy an entire lifetime.